Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at one of my rescue orchids. This one was given to me by a colleague, and it has already bloomed, but I have since then decided to use a different growing method for this orchid. So in this video, I would also talk a little bit about the thought process that I went through when deciding on what method to use for this orchid. But let's just go back in time and take a quick look just so we get a full understanding of how this orchid was and how it has become, how well it has been doing. So this is the video clip I took when I first got this orchid. And you can see here, it was pretty dry. This orchid allegedly had never received any water since it was purchased. So it's kind of a curse, but it's kind of a blessing because yes, the flower didn't last as long as they could have if there were more water provided. But because it was underwatered, so this was a slightly different rescue, because typically when you say you need to rescue an orchid, usually that's because all the roots were rotted or some root issue, and then leaf drop because of root rot. But this one, it was actually pretty okay. And then, so I decided to unpot it and then put it into water culture. And this is the 3 bloom that came out of the water culture method under my care. At the time, I wasn't thinking that this orchid would bloom at all. I was guessing that this orchid would probably skip 1 blooming cycle and then would start to be strong enough or healthy enough to provide, to be able to put out spike and blooms. But this orchid surprised me. And I'm guessing that I can attribute this bloom or success to the fact that I have central air, and I was able to provide a very specific temperature for the nighttime temperature drop, right? I usually set it to be between 55 and 65 Fahrenheit. I think at last year I kept it at 60 degree Fahrenheit. So that's probably around 15 or 16 degrees centigrade or Celsius. So because I have central air, so it's easy for me to control the temperature. And for that 1 month, and usually I do it right after Thanksgiving. So basically end of November and throughout December, that 1 month, I make sure that my grow space is cold enough. And I think that might have contributed or initiated the flower spike growth. Either way, I was really happy because I really didn't think that this orchid would bloom right when it did, because it was pretty dry. And I also remember that this orchid did not quite have that many good roots. I mean, it had okay amount of viable roots, but it wasn't good enough that I think this orchid would do well. So that's why I wanted to use water culture to try to revive this orchid back to health, back on track. I wasn't expecting bloom, but I'll take any bloom I can get. And this orchid actually is quite charming. It has that yellow background, light yellow flower on the petals and sepals, but then the lip is quite interesting, right? It has that magenta pink color with really curly lip tips, which I enjoy a lot. I've always enjoyed using water culture as a method to revive orchids, but I only have less than 10 orchids in with water culture method at the moment because it actually requires a lot more time. It consumes more time than other orchids grown in different methods, because I noticed that I tend to need to constantly observe the water and roots relationship, the relationship between water and roots. And the reason I say that is you do have to take into account the temperature, humidity, but then based on what you see with the roots, you then have to adjust either the water level or take out water completely. But then how often you allow the roots to dry, bare roots, and allow the roots to dry, and how often you leave the water inside the cup to let it just soak. I know typically for water culture, the general rule of thumb is bottom third of the roots submerged in water. But what I have done is I usually just only allow very tiny little amount if the roots can reach the bottom. Otherwise, I would increase the water level to a point where just a small portion of the longest root can touch the water. So that way, this orchid can get hydrated without having too much root in the water, because in case this orchid doesn't like water culture, you would have less chance of having too much roots, too big of a portion of the roots being rotted away. And I have found that water culture in conjunction with liquid seaweed is a really good way to revive orchids that are already stressed. So liquid seaweed is a really good growth hormone to use on orchids to help root production. And when your orchids have enough roots, it would have better capability and efficiency to intake water. And that's what I have found to be really helpful. You use water culture and you make sure all the conditions are met, but then at the same time, you use the hormone, the liquid seaweed, to help. And here what you're seeing is, okay, after the blooms were done, completely gone, I decided that I need to change a growth method, because I realized that this orchid just didn't grow that many roots during the water culture method. I mean, yes, it did okay, it bloomed, even though with just 3 flowers, it was still something. However, compared to other water culture orchids and the amount of roots that those have, this one really is a underperformer. And that's why I decided that I wanted to change something, and I eventually landed on the method of no drainage hole moss method. This is another interesting method that's slightly unconventional, but I've also found it really interesting, and it has actually been working pretty well for another about 10 orchids in my collection. And some of them are actually more expensive primary hybrids that are doing really well in this type of method. No drainage hole moss method. But the trick or tip is you want to make sure your moss is fluffy inside the container. You do not want to pack it down too much, because you really want to allow maximum aeration, air in the media. And what I have done is I would use my breath technique. I would try to blow some air into the media and see if it's light enough that some air would go through. And if the breath is immediately bouncing back at me, that means that no air is going down, and that means that the media, the moss, may be packed a little bit too tight. And this method, when done right, this is also a almost set it and forget it method, because if I don't want to soak this orchid, if I don't need to soak it, I only need to add a certain amount of water into the cup, and then I would know that it would be okay for another 7 days. So this is a fun method. If you haven't tried it, you should. So with regards to the flower spike, because it was still not dry, it wasn't growing, but it was not dry, so I left it alone. I didn't cut it off. That's just how I usually do it, how I deal with my flower spike. And here you see that I had used a marker to mark on this 8-ounce cup because that's the amount that would equate to about 1/4 cup. And so that is the amount of water that I usually give to this orchid, and I just pour it into the cup. Yes, there will be initially some water at the bottom, but because sphagnum moss is really absorbent, so my experience is that typically after about half an hour, the water will be evenly distributed and you will see that the top layer of the moss is also moist. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!